Hello everyone and welcome to another video on building serverless applications on AWS with .NET. In this video, we're going to have a look at one of the new features announced at reInvent this year, and that is Amazon EventBridge pipes. And by the end of this video, we're going to look at how you can use EventBridge pipes using .NET and the AWS CDK. Now, if you're not familiar with EventBridge pipes, it allows you to connect parts of your application together without the need for what we would commonly call glue code. Now, one of the examples I always like to look at when I talk about pipes is the example of SQS to StepFunctions. So you have messages landing in an SQS queue and you want to start a StepFunctions workflow using them messages. Before pipes, you would have needed a Lambda function to do that. You would need a Lambda function to take the messages off the queue and then actually start your step function execution. Pipes reduces the need for you to do that. You can configure a number of different things. So the first thing you can configure is a source. There's a whole range of different sources supported currently with EventBridge pipes, and this is likely to extend in the future. Currently, you've got things like SQS, DynamoDB, Kinesis, Kafka, all of these different sources that can then come into a pipe. The second thing you can do with your pipe is apply some filters. So you can apply filtering using the same syntax that you would for EventBridge rules. So you can pattern match on the message that comes into the pipe and choose to filter if you wanted to or if you didn't. One of the coolest features of pipes is this enrichment step. And you can use enrichment to get additional data that you might need as part of this pipe. So let's take a order processing example. And let's say we get a order event of SQS in the source. So we get that here. We filter it through and then it comes to the enrichment step and we need to grab the delivery address for the customer. We could do that using enrichment. Maybe we make a call to the customer API. We make a HTTP call. Maybe we invoke a step function and the output of the step function will actually then be added into our message as it flows through the pipes. So enrichment is really cool to add this additional data. And then finally, you can set a target. So in the example we're talking through, that might be step functions. We've taken the order of SQS, we've enriched it with some customer data, and then we've targeted that to step functions and we've kicked off our order processing workflow. And all of this together makes up a pipe. So as I said, for the rest of this video, we're now going to walk through how you can use pipes with the AWS CDK. So let's flick over to a terminal window and let's make a new CDK project. So I'm going to create a new folder called CDK pipes. And then I'm going to do a CDK init app and pass in the language as C#. And we'll just let that create now. So that has finished creating, and then I'm just going to open up my solution file in my IDE. So here we are in Rider now, and let's actually go and start creating some pipes. So if I open up my, my stack, and we'll just zoom this in a little bit, and this is where we can actually start to define what we do. So in this example, we're going to stick with that same thing. We're going to go messages from an SQS queue, and we're going to use that to invoke a step function workflow. So the first thing we'll create is we will create a new SQS queue, and we will call that source SQS queue for the purposes of this. Let's just add our dependencies there. And we want the CDK queue, not a collection queue. So we've now got a queue. And then let's also create our target step function. So let's go target step function and we will create a new state machine. And we will call that our target state machine. If I could type, and then we will pass in our properties for this state machine. Let's call the state machine pipes target state machine. And we will just leave it at that for the moment. We'll come back to the actual state machine definition in just a moment. So the other thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to actually create some IAM policies and IAM roles to allow pipes to actually access some of this information. So rather than me writing out an entire IAM policy, I'm just going to grab that from a code sample over here, and we will talk through exactly what's going on here in just a second. So if I just grab the source policy as well, paste that in, and we'll just talk through exactly what is happening here. So I'm creating a new IAM policy, and I'm going to set that IAM policy to allow receive and delete from our SQS queue that we've just created above. So you can see that there, I'm passing in my QARN as the resource, and here are all the actions that I'm allowing this policy to do. So anything you would need to poll and receive from SQS. I've also then got my target policy here, and this is where I am going to allow a start execution for the state machine that we've just created. So this is what will allow pipes to actually start a new execution of this step function workflow. And then finally, we just need to create a role for our pipe to use. So again, if I just grab some code from over here, pop that in there. So we're going to create a new role that pipes will be able to use. You see that this is allowed to be assumed by pipes.amazon.aws.com. That's the service principal for pipes. You notice, although it's part of EventBridge, it uses a different service principal. So EventBridge will be events.amazon.aws.com. In this case, we're using pipes.amazon.aws.com. So now we've got everything we need to actually be able to go off and create our pipe. And currently in the CDK, there's only actually an L1 construct for creating pipes. So we can create the pipe using the exact same properties that we would in CloudFormation. So if I create a new pipe now, and I'm going to create that using the CFN pipe object, and that comes from the amazon.cdk.aws.pipes namespace. I'm going to create a new pipe, and I'm going to call it my new pipe, nice and creative with the naming, and then we can pass in some properties. Now again, if you're using the L1 constructs in the CDK, and that will then be anything that begins with CFN, you can actually use the CloudFormation documentation to know which properties need to be set. So I know, for example, we need to set the role ARN, and we can do that using the pipe role ARN. There we are. We also need to then set up our source. So currently with this L1 construct, the source just takes in a string. So in this case, because we're using the an SQS queue, we can just pass in our QARN. Whatever the source will be, it will be the ARN for that source as a raw string. And then we can pass in a set of source parameters, and these are the parameters that will actually define how our source is going to work. And if we look at the data type of these source parameters, it actually takes in a nullable object. So really we could pass in absolutely anything here, right? But what we actually do have is some strongly typed classes that allow us to define these different parameters. So if we look under the CFN pipe namespace, we have actually all of these different things we can use. And if we look, we have actually got this pipe source parameters property. So we can create a new one of them. And then in there, we have all of the different types of sources that are supported right now in pipes. So you can see we've got Kinesis, SQS, ActiveMQ, Dynamo, Kafka, RabbitMQ, and also self-managed Kafka. So these are all the different sources currently that can be applied to EventBridge pipes. And of course, we're going to use SQS queue parameters. And again, this takes a nullable object as the data type, but we also have a strongly typed object for that. So if we create a new CFN pipe, we have this pipe source parameters property. And this allows us to define the different parameters that allow sourcing from SQS. And if we take a look at what we've got under here, we can pass in, much like you would if you're using Lambda and SQS, you can pass in a batch size and how long you want your batching window to be. So for the purposes of this, let's say we have a batch size of 5 and a batching window of, let's say, 10 seconds, for example. And that's how we can set up our source. So let's have a look at the target now. So we'll create a target parameters. And again, target parameters work in much the same way as the source parameters. It takes in a nullable object, but we have these strongly typed classes around the targets. So we have this pipe target parameters property. And then within there, we also have all of the different targets that are currently supported with pipes and the CDK. So you see, we've got like HTTP requests, we can start batch jobs, we can invoke a Lambda function, we can send data to EventBridge, we could send it to another queue. There's all these different things we can do within pipes. And remember, this is now completely no code. There's no glue code here. All of this integration is now managed by AWS. So of course, we're going to use StepFunction state machine parameters. You're probably getting the idea now that there is actually a strongly typed object for the parameters here. So we've got this state machine parameters property, and within there, we just pass in an invocation type. And in this case, the invocation type is going to be fire and forget. Now here, you can either use fire and forget, or you can use a more synchronous invoke as the invocation type. Fire and forget will just start the state machine, and then the pipe will stop running. The one other thing we need to add is the actual target itself, and the target here is going to be our target step function and the ARN. And there we are. That's all we need to set up a simple pipe. We've got the role defined up at the top here. Then we define the source queue that we want to use, and then all of the parameters that are required for that SQS queue. And then the same again with the target. We're defining the ARN of our target, and then also passing in the parameters of our target there. And then we've also got our role here just to ensure that our pipe has permissions both to pull things from SQS and then also target a StepFunctions workflow. So let's just come back to our state machine now. So currently this step function isn't actually doing anything. And much like when you use Lambda with SQS, the messages that get passed into this state machine will be passed in as a batch of messages. So you won't get a single message, you'll get a batch, and you'll need to handle that within your workflow. And how I'm going to handle that here is I'm going to create a new map state for my state machine to use. And I'm going to call that base map state, and I'm going to pass in some map properties. And all we need to set in our properties is the path in our JSON input where the array is. Now the array is going to be at the entire payload, so we can use this JSON path.entire payload property, and that will then show that the map state uses the entire payload that's passed into StepFunctions, which is going to be an array of SQS messages. And then what we can do with our map state, we can set the iterator for our map state, and this is what will actually happen within the map, within the for each. And for the purposes of just this demonstration, I'm just going to create a new wait state. We'll call that 5-second wait. We'll create some new wait properties, and we will then just pass in the wait time. So we'll use wait time.duration, and then we'll use duration.seconds and 5. So now we've defined a map state here. So we've got our map, and remember the payload that comes into our step function is going to be an array of messages. It's going to be the batch of messages that have been pulled from SQS. And we can use this JSON path.entire payload property to actually tell StepFunctions to use the entire payload as the array. And then we're then also for each message that comes from SQS, we're then just going to wait for 5 seconds. Here you might make a call off to another step function to actually start your order processing workflow. You know, the world's your oyster here. You could do almost anything, and we'll just get rid of that pesky additional bracket. Oh yeah, we get a comma there. Not that's what I call it. There we go. And then all we need to do is just change our step function, and we just set the definition of our step function to be our map state. And that is all we need. We're now ready to go. We have a functioning pipe. So let's just run through this one more time before we go off and deploy it and look at it in the console. So we create a SQS queue, and then we set up the actual workflow that our step function is going to use. And what we're going to do is we're going to iterate over the batch of messages that come in from SQS. And for each message that comes in from SQS, we're just going to wait for 5 seconds. So we then go off and set up our permissions that our pipe's going to need. And from a source perspective, our pipe is going to need permission to read from SQS. So we need to receive the message and then delete the message after it's been processed, of course. And then we also need to allow our pipe to be able to start the execution of our step function. And we do that by passing in the ARN of our step function that's going to be used. And then finally, we create a role that can be assumed by pipes. So we're saying that the pipe service can assume this role. And then the last thing we're doing is actually creating our pipe, and we pass in the role ARN, we pass in the source and the source parameters, and then we pass in the target and the target parameters. If we just have a look at the other properties available on this CFM pipe, you can also pass in enrichment. So you could pass in the ARN of another step function to do enrichment, for example. And similarly, you have these enrichment parameters that you can use to actually configure how that enrichment's going to work. It follows the exact same pattern as we have for target and target parameters. So let's flick back over to our terminal window now. We'll just clear all this out, and then we will just run a CDK deploy, and we'll let that actually go off and deploy our resources to AWS. I'm just going to pause the video while this deploys, and I'll come back in just a moment and we'll have a look at this in the AWS console. Okay, so that has finished deploying now. So let's just flick over to the AWS console and we can have a look at how this looks in here. So if I first open up the Amazon EventBridge console, you see we've got this new pipes option over on the left-hand side, just over here. And this is where all of the configuration of pipes will happen. So if I go into there and we have a look at pipes, and we see we've got the pipe that I've just created. We've got our last modified date there called my new pipe. So let's go in and have a look at that. And you get this really nice visual explanation of what's actually going on within the pipe. We've got our SQS source, and then we've got our step functions target, and we can see things around monitoring, the execution roles and things like that in this screen as well. If I go in and just look to edit my pipe, you can see here how we can start to add enrichment. So we can do these different things for enriching our pipes, and also providing pattern matching to do the filtering, and also the UI is smart enough to know that we've got an SQS source. So it's actually given us a sample message here of what the SQS payload might look like. So how can we actually test this out now? Well, if I go over to SQS and I have a look at the pipe that's been created, so we've got that source SQSQ pipe, and I go into there, I can then send a new message into my queue from within the console. So let's pretend this is an order ID, and we're going to send in a new order with an ID of 1234, for example. If I hit send message there, that message has now been placed onto my queue. And if I come back to my actual queue list here, we should see that we've actually got a message in flight. Now notice that the message isn't available. And that's because the second that message has hit the queue, our pipe has picked that up now. So the pipe has taken that message and it is now running through our pipe. If we refresh this a couple of times, we can see that the message is still in flight, pipes are still processing it. And now we're saying that the message in flight is 0. This tells me that it's been processed. So let's go over to our step function now, and we've got this pipes target state machine that we created. If we look at the definition here, you can see we've got our map state with a 5-second wait, as we described in .NET in the CDK. And we look at our executions, and you see we've got one new execution here at 1:08 PM. That's the one we've just created, and we go and have a look at this execution, and we can actually go in and see the input payload, and we have a look here. And if I just extend this section here, and you can see the input to our map state was this message. So this is actually what's gone into the map state itself, not into the actual workflow. If we come down to the bottom here and we look at this execution started, here is the actual payload that came into step functions. And you notice that it is actually an array. We've got our array brackets there, and we've got one entire message in our payload. We only sent one message into the SQS queue, right? And then that's gone, it's iterated over. And if we look at these other events down at the bottom here, you see we've got one iteration and we've got one wait state entered for the one message that we happened, and that wait state took about 5 seconds. And that's it. That's as easy as pipes is. It really nicely fits into the CDK. And even though we've only got this L1 construct at the minute, it's still a really intuitive syntax to get up and get started and starting to integrate your applications together in a much easier way. I know I'm certainly incredibly excited about this ability now to source things from SQS and send them to different targets in a more low-code way, because that's one less piece of application code that I need to manage. So I can see so many use cases for pipes in AWS, and as the sources and the targets start to expand out, it's only going to get more powerful. As always, if you've liked this video, please subscribe, please like, please share. That is all out for today. That was EventBridge Pipes. If you've got any questions, drop them in the comments. Please feel free to reach out on any of the social medias, and I will see you next time.